Hi, Changemakers. It's me, Mo Birkner-Boyd. I want to dig into the human side of change. I want to have real conversations with the people who are doing the messy work of leading change and not burning people out in the process. I'm going to go deep with some of the best change and integration leaders about what's working. We'll wonk out on the data, weave in the neuroscience, and work through the challenges. Welcome to the Make or Break podcast. In this episode of Make or Break, I was joined by Dr. Alexis Fink, and we had a phenomenal conversation. We talked about everything from Snoopy sheets and wastewater treatment plants to thinking about data from both a microscope to a telescope viewpoint, and aligning people, systems, process, what to let go of, what to keep, what to track, what not to. And I just really appreciated the conversation. I know you will too. Let's jump in. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Make or Break, the podcast where we talk about everything at the intersection of people and disruptive change. You know, when you get to finally chat with and interview somebody that you have, so many people are like, oh, you two should talk. You should to talk. That is Dr. Alexis Fink and I. I am so excited for this conversation. She is one of the leading voices in people analytics, talent management, and large-scale organizational transformation at some big companies, y'all. Microsoft, Intel, Meta, you may have heard of them. Over the past 2 decades, she built and led global teams that connect rigorous science with practical solutions in areas like strategic workforce planning, culture, and employee experience. Alexis is a PhD Smarty Pants in industrial organizational psychology, a fellow and past president of PSYOP, a prolific author, editor, and speaker. And I love this, and it's one of the reasons I'm so excited about this conversation. She's known for clear, no-nonsense ways of taking the complex analytics and research and actually turning them into strategies that executives can use to drive impact. So, Alexis, I am delighted to have you here today.
I've so been looking forward to this conversation. I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
I do too. I do too. And so let's talk. You've made a bit of a pivot and you're consulting now,
Yep.
and you focus in 3 core areas. So leadership, org design, and AI activation. At the center of all of that, right, are best practices around people. And
Yeah.
and this is where I'm excited to hear some of the data that you have about what actually works, right? For a leadership and org design perspective, when we're talking about disruptive change, I think people feel like this is mystical and magical, but what can leaders do? How can organizations be designed, tweaked, changed so that people can actually thrive during change versus survive?
Oh, that thriving question is absolutely one of my favorites. And really, the through line through everything I do and everything I love is this question of organization transformation. And how do we make sure that the organization we are leaning into is as well fitted to the challenges and opportunities of the moment as the organization we
Mm,
inhabited in the past? In other words, in order to have the same kind of success, we need to do different things because the context moves around us. And so when you ask about thriving, there is this need to be able to be clear-eyed about what you have that's a strategically differentiated asset and what you
mm.
can change to make sure you're using that as well as possible. It's been fun to look even over, not sure what the release date will be for this podcast, but even over just like the last couple of weeks, we've seen interesting data coming out that most of your big AI projects, the ones that aren't being AI washed, most of your real big AI implementations are not actually reducing headcount. Most of what they're doing is creating new opportunity, things you couldn't do before, unleashing people to do more interesting work, to stretch into new places, et cetera. So while many of the large scale layoffs we're seeing are being sort of blamed on AI, when you get into the actual projects, we're not seeing that that it's universally true, right? So there is this wonderful opportunity for thriving in periods of transformation if you can see through to embracing new possibilities, embracing
Mm.
greater innovation, embracing opportunities to uplevel the skills of folks who are doing work. And the change management community has known something about how to do these things for decades, right? How do you listen to people doing the work? How do you make sure you're looking at an entire process end to end instead of just speeding up one step in the middle? These are fairly typical standard techniques that you can apply to new problems in order to create new possibilities.
Well, and I think what I love, what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm not hearing this correctly. I think about this as a data set of one. If I think about a person, right? As
Yeah.
I think about a person, I can't continue to be the same person, act and behave in the same way as I did 20 years ago. If I
Right.
want, if I want different, the world has changed around me. The tools that I can use have changed, so I have to adapt. I have to change. Now, take that to an What I hear you saying is take that to an
Yep.
organization.
Exactly.
The organization can't remain the same, in the context of the world and the transformative change happening around it. If you try and do that, that's where you're going to have the friction and the tension. Is that am I?
The friction, the tension, and the poor results, right?
Mm.
Hanging on too closely to an entire set of things can be problematic, as opposed to identifying one or two of those things that are really core to your identity and then figuring out how to adapt so that you are really well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities of the moment ahead of you. There's sort of an old adage in the change management world that people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And when people talk to me about this, I'm like, so you still sleeping with your Snoopy sheets? Like, people
Exactly
love
right.
change. They really do. They want to update their kitchens and get married and move out of the house and or get divorced and move out of the house. They want to embrace change that fits who they are and what their needs are. And organizations need the opportunity to do the same thing if they're going to thrive. And we also know that if you think about the AI stuff that's so common right now, most of the insight about what's really happening is sitting fairly deep in the organization. As much as I
Mm,
spend time with executives, a lot of times they don't actually know what the tasks and skills are. That sits
right.
fairly deep, which means if you're going to do this transformation and you're going to create space for thriving, you really need to be engaging with those people who know and understand the work. And that also lets them have some control and agency in how and how quickly and in what ways the organization changes.
Well, and I think that's it, right? Like the it's translating the here's our strategy to who's getting their hands dirty.
Right. Yep.
Who's the and by the way, if there are any people still with your Snoopy sheets, like keep your hate to yourself, right? We support you. um So then, we've sort of been circling around it. Let's talk about AI activation because that is like the
Yeah.
800-pound gorilla right now.
Yep.
People have all the feels about it, right? From
Yep.
from being terrified to being curious to ambivalent, like all of it. And what are you seeing? What is actually working to move people to leaning into what will be the biggest transformation any of us ever lived through?
Boy, the first thing to know is that consistently I'm in groups where you do like one of these little Menti polls or something and say, hey, where are you? Like real talk in terms of doing this. And overwhelmingly, the majority of the group is still in an experimentation phase. So we're still figuring it out several years into this, despite the fact in the first year it's like, oh, all frontline jobs will be gone. That's not true. There are some really important nuances around how this works. And the best use cases are things that are fairly low risk, fairly low complexity, and very high volume. And that's
Okay,
not
right. Say that again.
so
The
fairly low risk. In other words, the
Yep.
consequences are not dire. It's not life and death. It's not company ending revenue decisions. It's a fairly low risk or easily mitigatable risk
Great.
within whatever the task you're asking for is. It's
Okay.
also relatively low complexity. You can do it in a couple of steps with a few instructions, not something incredibly complicated. And then the third criterion is it needs to be fairly high volume in
Mm,
order for the effort to really build a true agentic system that has all the quality controls and things in it, for that to really make sense. And it turns out then in organizations there are large swaths of that because it's high volume, but there's also an enormous amount of work that is complementary to that. And so
mm,
there will be work building those systems, but there's also work approving things and work that is still very fundamentally human, even in organizations that have gone pretty deeply into investing in these spaces. So, in terms of being ready, uh, the first piece of advice I would give people is to make sure that your data house is in order
mm.
because like, do you remember on public radio, there used to be this call-in show where you could say, "I have these 4 ingredients in my fridge," and they'd try
Yeah,
and figure
yeah.
out what you can make out of it, right?
I love it.
Um, right? For a lot of organizations, that's kinda what they're trying to do with their data, and it turns out if you get into data audits, often data is pretty the technical term is usually sparse, but there's not much there because they've just been recording transactions. They've been recording what happens and not why it happens. So you can't make a different thing happen. They may have been recording things as a snapshot in time, and the data are old and they aren't relevant anymore. Or they may have been limited by the architecture of data where they couldn't join things. And classically in organizations, there's a difference between the way financial systems handle data, which is usually sort of organized by a cost center or a product, and the way people systems handle data, which is usually organized by reporting hierarchy. And those things don't always mesh up.
Mm.
And on top of that, you've got enormous amounts of data that we haven't had a good way to process. Image data, stuff that's trapped in PowerPoints, et cetera. And now what AI is doing is making it possible to actually access data that was never available before. And I don't think most companies had someone manually transcribing their PowerPoints to put it into a system. They simply didn't access that data in a scaled way. So
Right.
now they can access that data in a scaled way, which lets them make better predictions, do a better job with their succession planning, like whatever their particular need might be. They have access to new data sources, and they're able to now do things that were never possible. One of the risks that's really important, just in the last couple of days, I read kind of a frightening study that even before ChatGPT sort of hit the airwaves, if you will, radiology was a leading use case for visual intelligence, right? It was being able to find cancers that oncologists were missing. Really exciting work. And now, as we're having more LLMs doing it, we're finding again, there was a study just out a few days ago, pre-peer review, so take that for what you will, but showing that some of these systems would very confidently describe an image that had not been uploaded. So they would
Oof.
completely invent it, no image whatsoever, which then starts to help you understand why we still need humans doing these jobs, why we still need checks and balances to make sure that what we're getting back out of the systems meets our expectations and requirements for what we're putting into them or what we're asking of them. There's a lot of space left and there's a lot of opportunity.
I think that's really interesting. When I was first couple of weeks using AI and I was, building little agents,
Yeah,
experimenting.
right.
And I remember thinking to myself, and I've said this since many times, AI with experience is so powerful.
Mhm.
And AI and inexperience is so dangerous.
So dangerous. Yep.
Right? And that's such a stark reminder, right? That going back to what we're seeing in terms of what it's allowing, it is allowing the higher order thinking that we're doing, right? To be able to be creative and interpret and do things that before we were, shuffling spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Do you have a quick recommendation? Because you said get your data house in order.
Yeah.
Do you have, what would you say? Like, where would you start if somebody's like, "Oh my god, I actually didn't even realize we had a data house." Do you know what I mean? Like,
Um, so Data governance and data cleaning and data management are all deeply unsexy. I usually use an analogy that it's a lot like a wastewater treatment system. And wastewater treatment is the biggest boon to human health in civilization, right? It is the
Yep.
number one thing for human longevity, but you definitely don't want to think about it. You don't want to see it. It just sits there on the street doing its job, goes away somewhere. Like it's this
Yep.
magical thing that keeps all of us from getting cholera. And your data systems often operate the same way. They're sort of unseen, sometimes by design. And so my first piece of recommendation, if you're trying to do this, would be to do a little bit of a data audit, to go
Mm.
back and say, what's the data source I need? What's the timestamp on this? When was this collected? Let me do some sort of a validation check against what I think is true. And what you'll often find in organizations is they'll have the same sort of key or anchor across several databases or tools. They will often have many fields that have the same name. I remember doing a data audit once, and I found 8 different fields named start date, and all of them had different information in them because they were all referring to different things, right?
Yep.
And if
Yep.
you didn't know which one you needed, you could really go pretty far off base. So figure out what data it is you're relying on, and figure out how confident you can be in that data. I also once did a data audit and found a field that we were using was accurate only 30% of the time.
Oof.
And it was a field that was imported from your recruiting notes about your highest level of education. This was a past employer many years ago. I won't name them because it's embarrassing to be 30% accurate. But this particular employer hired a lot of people out of high school, and then they used their tuition reimbursement to get multiple degrees and do all kinds of things. So there's a person on my team who was director level doing a pretty sophisticated data job, had 2 master's degrees already. And in the system, in this uneditable field from when she was 18, it said she only had a high school education. And
Oh,
we were
geez.
using that to do all kinds of predictions about strategic workforce planning and our leadership bench and things like that. So go back and find what's really in your data and make sure that it's painting a picture of reality that you agree with.
Well, and what a commercial for making sure that what you just described was that great example of something remaining the same
Yeah.
when the system around it had totally
Right?
changed.
That's right.
Right. So I think that's a right, like to also say you need a source of truth,
Mhm,
and that source of truth also needs to be updated in terms
mhm.
of how, when, who, what is being collected
That's
and
right.
audited. And I think, you know, okay, we could walk on data forever. I'm going to move us on.
Yeah.
So back to the humans and humans thriving during
Yes.
disruptive change. What's a people metric that you think should be tracked? That
Ooh.
maybe some people and I'm gonna ask a second one, what's one people metric that you think is tracked that is BS?
Oh gosh. So you're gonna hate the fact that I'm gonna say it's always gonna be contextual, right?
Yeah, yep,
And
yep.
it's gonna be grounded in your strategy. And so under normal conditions, you would look at internal differences in attrition to see if there were pockets that had problems, because the external market really influences overall patterns. Like, is it a buyer's market or a seller's market? Right now, we've got a pretty locked up labor market. So we've seen depression in rates overall across attrition. But individual pockets, teams, levels, et cetera, can give you a signal of where there's some kind of a problem. And that's one that every organization has. It's one that's intuitive. It's one that you can know yourself as a leader. Golly, my frontline people are all bailing on me. What does that mean? Right? Or my
What am I
mid-level
doing?
managers are bailing on me, right?
So I really wanna drill down on this contextual. I've been asked over time so many times, who's what company
Mhm.
is getting culture right, or what company is XYZ, and I say no company.
Right.
Um, it's everything is at that team level, right? Like what is happening at that team level because that's the experience. So you're saying track it down to
A
not
fairly
just
granular level.
yeah, not the peanut butter spread,
Right.
dig, right? Dig. And
That's
then
right.
what is that? And what's that telling you? And I loved what you just said in terms of then having your leaders and managers reflect. What are these numbers telling you about what's happening, right? That is under your I'm never going to say control, right? But in your right in your little part of this organization, okay, what is this telling you? The good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And to be
Yeah.
able to face the brutal data.
Right. And I recognize that there are, if we want to stick with attrition for a minute, I recognize that there are organizations now under headcount pressure that are saying any person who leaves, you can't backfill that head, which means managers are going to hang on to anybody they have with both hands, even sometimes underperformers, because an underperformer is better than no one, right? Except that what that does is really lock people in, and the it is challenging for a manager to stop and say, the best service I can do to my best employees is to help folks move on to their next role. That's the kind of thing that makes me a talent attractor, that folks know that I am going to be there for them, that I am going to help support their teams. And by the way, even if you're not getting to backfill that head, then that might be one fewer that you have to lay off in the future. Like, how do you think about this at a system level in every case? How do you ground things in strategy and what you're trying to achieve? And it takes a moment and it takes some discipline to step out of your knee jerk day to day needs and say, what is the larger picture? What is the goal that I'm trying to achieve? And that does, your question started with thriving, that does really help support not only individual thriving, but sort of team thriving. It helps you as a manager to feel better about things, but also, I'll tell you, I've been, working hard to export my talent for a long time, and those relationships really come back to be useful, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
They the internally, it's the best network you could possibly have about what's happening in other places. Externally, it's also an amazing network you can have about
Yes.
what's happening in
Yes.
other places. If you should suddenly find yourself without a role, I'm in my post-corporate season now, but there's one, role that just popped that, for a variety of reasons, I think a dozen people in the space of a day said, "Oh my god, you have to look at this. This might really work for you." And it's like, I'm not even looking. And people who used to work for me are like, "Wait, you'd be amazing in this job. They should really hire you." So, like,
Well,
these things do play out over the long game.
yeah, yeah. And okay, so back there's just something that popped into my head the way you were describing this, right?
Yeah,
And you like using attrition and then then what are you doing with that data? But it's like microscope and telescope, right? You need to be
exactly.
looking like, right, what's happening on my team? How is that fitting with the strategy? How's that fitting
Yep.
with the bigger context of what's happening? Um, okay, so what what's a people metric that you think gets tracked that's just BS?
A lot of times I think attrition is just BS because they're using it as a program evaluation, and they're using it at a global level for a program evaluation. And sweetheart, I'm sorry, like your new onboarding tool in the context of everything else probably is not the biggest driver of the performance of the attrition rate for your company overall, right? There is just too much dilution, and I do think that that is one that gets overused because it is so easy, because it is so visceral. If you remember the Tversky and Kahneman stuff around loss aversion, like it's a fundamental human focus.
Yeah.
So I get why people want to look at it. It's easy to count, etc. But wow, is it ever influenced by a ton of things?
Well, and I think that that's so good to always be asking why. Why are we
Yes.
tracking this?
Yep.
What's the utility?
Yep.
What is it revealing to us that is important? Otherwise, let's not let's not track and let's certainly not do it if we're having to ask people for it.
Yeah. My two metrics questions, I always start with why does this matter? And how will we know? And if you have to
Mm,
ask a new question, you are almost by definition distorting what response you're getting. You may be only getting it from a portion of the population. We know that people tend to respond when they're unhappy or when they're very, very happy, but you'll kind of, there's a great cartoon I saw once that was like, hey, we asked people, how do you how much do you love surveys? And 99% of people said, I love them, of respondents said, I love them. And like 0.1% said, I throw them directly in the bin. I'm like, right, talk about a biased sample, right? So when you're going out and having to ask these things, often you're distorting your results in a way that makes them at least less meaningful, as opposed to trying to find something valuable.
Yeah.
I remember quite some time ago, I worked on a team where we really had a strategy around internal mobility. And so we built a metric that said, hey, you know what? 30% of roles need to be filled internally from someone outside that sort of pod, if you will, like someone
Yep.
who had to make a couple of hops to get there. So we were really trying to increase the movement across the organization as opposed to just from adjacent teams. And by looking at something I didn't have to ask you, like I think my career goals can be met, which you should ask on in some way because that does influence attrition and other things. And it can give you some signal. But instead of just asking that as part of your evaluation, looking at the behavior. If I think my
Mm.
career goals can be met and yet no one's are, then at some point that's gonna become problematic.
Yeah, right. I think they can, but it's not happening, right?
Right.
And I'm gonna find a place somewhere.
Right.
Um, is there a tool or a framework that sits at the intersection of people and disruption that really informs your work, right? And how you look at things?
So, a lot of what informs my work is less a tool and more a philosophy, and it's around
Mm,
systems thinking.
yes.
So really making sure, and there's some disciplines around systems thinking and how that works. There's some disciplines around problems that are complicated versus complex. And the
Mm,
nuance there is something complicated is like calculus. Like it has an answer and that answer can be right or wrong. And something that's complex does not necessarily have a right answer. It has a
mm.
solution and you choose a solution or you make a bet on something, but it doesn't have a right wrong kind of answer. It's not calculus, it's weather and weather, WEATHER, like
Yeah,
cloud.
yeah. It's employee experience and culture,
Exactly. And
right?
so,
That's
really thinking
complex.
about a systems approach to things, building out systems models, clearly articulating your theory of how things work. I
Mm.
have found statistically building structural equation models is a good way to have multiple levels and lots of factors that have different kinds of relationships, can help you visualize this sometimes and also quantify it if you have the technical ability and the raw data to do so. But it's less about a specific tool and much more about that philosophy of bringing a systems approach to solving the problem.
Oh, I love that. Um, I knew this time was gonna fly by. What about the human side of disruptive change makes or breaks success?
Oh, what a great answer. And what we're actually finding in this era of AI is that the technology is such a small part of what makes or breaks success. The ability to get the empirical data suggests the ability to get leaders who genuinely support, not just hand wave and say, use it, but remove blockers. And
Mm.
then genuinely getting alignment of people, process, and technology such that they can work together in a healthy system. And the only way to do that is to make sure you're involving the people doing the work. There's not a shortcut where you can wave your arm and make the right guesses and have it work.
Can you give me an example? Give folks an example of what does it look like to remove a blocker?
Ah, so removing a blocker might be a conflict between two teams, and they can't decide whose conflict is like whose position in that conflict is going to win. And they're
Mm,
peers, and neither one outranks the other, and they need somebody to come and say, "I hear both of you, and this is how we're going to." Not split the baby, right? This is the decision we're going to make. Other times it will be we have a missing piece of technology, and we need to have this stood up because we can't move forward until this criterion is true. This table exists. This data source is created, etc. And then sometimes it'll be as simple as budget. Like
mm.
I need 10 people to be pulled out of their existing teams to come and be a SWAT team that can move this forward for the next 6 weeks or 2 weeks or 10 days, whatever. Um, but
I love
whatever
that.
that. Yeah, whatever that thing is that is causing the team to be stuck, getting someone who will come in and unstick them.
Well, and I think that, right, the leaders who are, right, willing to remove those blockers and then involving the people, I would
Right.
actually have to be asking, "What's causing the friction here? What's
That's
getting in the
exactly right.
way?" Right? To be
Yep.
able to so involving the people in it. So I love that alignment of people, process, and technology.
Yeah.
And back to the very first thing that you said, what got you here won't get you there. So being willing to really look at all of those
Yep.
and say, what needs to change in the
Yep.
midst of this transformation? What serves us, what no longer serves us, what do we need to shed?
Yep. I love doing a
Right.
start, stop, continue. Like, here are the things that are
Yeah.
essential to us. We absolutely have to continue these things. These are non negotiable. Here's a bunch of stuff that we need to kind of Marie Kondo. We're going to thank it for its service and send it on its way. And then here's the new stuff that we have the opportunity to do. And our future success depends on our ability to seize that opportunity. And what are the trickle down impacts of those? What does that mean in terms of the way teams are organized? What does that mean in terms of the way we think about pay? What does that mean in terms of all of these different things? What we need to recruit for? We have habits of we've always prized these things. I was actually talking to somebody external HR leader who was talking about moving their company from being a hardware company to a software company. It's like, that's not just about hiring software engineers. That
Oh,
is a profound shift in the way, it's not just your sales cycle, the way you think about products. Right? The way you think about builds, the way you think about security, all kinds of things are fundamentally different as you move from being a hardware company to a software company, for example. And to address that, you have to get into all the culture stuff, right? All the habits and assumptions and things you know to be true that don't fit anymore.
yeah. Oh my gosh, that was such a great Alexis, where can people find your work? What have you got coming up? This has been a delightful conversation, and I know that you are prolific in terms of what you share, which is phenomenal, right? Because back
Oh,
to
thank you.
that, so what's the best place for people to keep track of you?
The easiest place to track me down is going to be on LinkedIn. Everything else kind of connects into there, Substack or anything else. So that's the easy place to find me. And there are not that many Alexis Finks on LinkedIn. I'm the blonde one that does people analytics. So
I love it, Alexis. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been fantastic.
this was a delight. Thank you so much.
Hey, you made it to the end of the episode. You are ride or die. Thank you again for joining us. If you like the podcast and want to stay connected, please hit subscribe. These are video podcasts, so join us on YouTube for the best experience of the show. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love connecting with people who are committed to human-centered change. See you on the next episode.